It's Thursday, the 24th of February 2005, and you're very welcome to the Inside Track on breakfornews.com. And this is Fintan Dunne reporting. It's a great day for me, and I hope for you. For me, because Kathy and I have worked very closely with Christine Maggiore of Alive and Well AIDS Alternatives based in Los Angeles. And Christine is probably the leading proponent of an alternative view of HIV/AIDS in the United States. She's been interviewed by Connie Chung on ABC. She's featured in Newsweek magazine, and she's brought forward serious questions about the HIV/AIDS paradigm. Those questions, of course, have an extra relevance right now because US health authorities plan to roll out what is effectively mandatory AIDS testing for everybody. And I hope that after our conversation today, you'll be a lot better educated about the implications of that move by health authorities. Just to remind you that you can check in the archives of breakfornews.com for our interview with Anthony Brink. He's the South African barrister whose investigations of AIDS drug AZT alerted South African President Thabo Mbeki to the questions which had been hanging around the AIDS paradigm for many years. They'd just never made it to the mainstream media. That all changed with the intervention of Thabo Mbeki and with a determined international campaign by the so-called AIDS dissidents. Out of that reassessment of the HIV/AIDS paradigm was born Alive and Well AIDS Alternatives, a very hands-on advocacy group that works for reform and also supports people. You can check the website at aliveandwell.org, and along the way, Christine has had a great deal of support, including support from high-profile scientists for her work, not to mention the backing of the Foo Fighters, a rock group with a conscience and with a determination to help Christine get the message out. Okay, that's the background. And Christine Maggiore is joining us on the line right now from Ventura Boulevard in Los Angeles. How you doing, Christine? It's great to talk to you, Christine, again.
It's been a long time.
It has, yeah. The battle goes on.
Doesn't it, though?
Yeah. We've been fighting on other fronts. Of course, we were very heavily involved in anti-war activism around the time of the planned invasion of Iraq and in coverage of the war. And one of the interesting...
Are you sure? I mean, how do you guys do it? Are you sure you're human?
No, I'm not actually, no. We're working on clones of ourselves, which would take some of the pressure off, yeah. You know the feeling, Christine.
Actually, I fail to live up to even the minimums I expect of myself most every day. You know, the kids, the laundry, the bills, the house, the meals, the shopping, the garden, the pets, the school runs, it's just...
Yeah, and in between all that, relentless activism against the pharmaceutical industry, which has got all the money in the world. Yeah. So, yeah.
Or at least, too, the way we live our lives is activism, so... Even when I'm not doing something direct, just living our lives seems to send ripples throughout our social circles. Mm-hmm. You know, it more people question things simply by virtue of knowing us.
Yes, we are having an effect. When you look right into the heart of it, the pharmaceutical industry, the pesticides industry, and the munitions industry all come out of the same military-industrial complex.
Their history leads back to the same entities. We have a real disconnect with what would be called the liberal left, the progressive media. It will question and even deplore Bush on everything except AIDS. It will condemn the multinational the multinational chemical corporations on everything except AIDS drugs.
One of the highlights for me has been finally getting Robin's movie, The Other Side of AIDS, out there. Not just out there, but out of 1,500 entries into the International Film Festival where it competed, it got the award. So not just any old film, but a historic landmark film.
They awarded it for its courage and its clarity and its unique focus, and gave it a special jury award in the documentary category.
Absolutely, and the media response was good too. LA Weekly called it a
cinematic hand grenade.
A cinematic hand grenade, it sure is. From the Hollywood Reporter, The Other Side of AIDS makes a substantial contribution to the international debate about the AIDS epidemic. Robin Scoville's film presents skeptical voices that challenge the conventional wisdom that HIV causes AIDS. You're still on the planet, you're still hanging in there, Christine. You got diagnosed HIV positive at one point.
Yes, actually, I just had my 13th year anniversary of testing positive, and if you go by the mainstream practice of contact tracing, I go back 20 years to being positive, presumably, supposedly, allegedly. Just to summarize with listeners, I have a 7-year-old son and a 3-year-old daughter who, despite my having tested positive, were born naturally without any medical intervention and breastfed, and they are today two of the most beautiful, gloriously healthy, amazing children, I'm sure, at least on our block, if not the entire universe. So, I'm hanging in here along with thousands of other people whose names never appear on the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah, and whose common characteristic is that despite this alleged death sentence of HIV positivity, they remained positive in mental attitude and they stayed away from toxic pharmaceutical drugs and enhanced their health other ways.
I would agree with that point of commonality, either through information and sometimes intuition. People find paths to health that do not include the pharmaceutical drugs. And many of us have come to recognize that testing HIV positive does not indicate urgent medical condition that needs to be treated with highly toxic pharmaceutical drugs that can cause everything from organ failure to paralysis to deformities to bone death to diabetes, pancreatitis. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on.
The majority of patients right now diagnosed HIV positive and in a hospital are there for side effects of drugs. They're losing their livers, they're suffering heart disease, and a whole load of other complications.
Well, here in the U.S., according to a study that was presented at the 14th International AIDS Conference in Barcelona, the leading cause of death today among HIV-positive Americans is liver failure caused by the drug therapies.
Well, yeah, it is heartbreaking to see the physical effects on people of taking these drugs. We have to have sympathy for those who have been deceived by the propaganda of the HIV/AIDS industry.
I also think it's important to acknowledge that for some people in certain circumstances of dire illness, taking these drugs appears to provide at least a temporary beneficial effect. I'm not suggesting that this is a first line of defense kind of treatment or a good idea for anyone who is not ill, but in certain cases they have shown anecdotally to reverse people in dire health. But there are no scientific studies anywhere that can recreate these so-called Lazarus effects in a controlled environment consistently, and no studies that compare HIV positives taking the drugs with HIV positives not taking any of the drugs.
This is not a film which was a polemic. It presented two sides of a story, and it told the alternative side very, very well.
It leaves a lot of room for people to make up their own minds, which is what Alive and Well, our efforts are about, is providing people with a basis of information they can use to draw their own conclusions.
And against that kind of background of shameless fear-mongering based on no science, it's not very encouraging that they have plans for mandatory AIDS testing.
It's actually called recommended testing. Doctors are supposed to recommend to patients, all patients, men, women, and it seems even children, that they regularly be tested on these so-called HIV antibody tests. But these things turned into mandates, and you find yourself here in what is presumably a free country having to fight, run, hide, because we don't have choices with regard to this. We're living, as some educated person state, in what essentially amounts to a pharmocracy. We're not a democracy. We're a nation run by pharmaceutical interests, and this is yet another example of how that has permeated our present day, what's supposed to be medical policy.
Even the medical profession itself would have to admit that when you take a test devised for such a narrow range of testing of and begin to apply it in a mass way to the population, the number of false positives is going to just run right out of proportion.
Well, from my experience at Alive and Well, we get calls, I would say weekly, from people with absolutely no risk factors whatsoever who are coming up positive when they go for an insurance screening, when they go for a prenatal exam, when they try to get life insurance or health insurance, these sorts of things. Here, people with absolutely no explanations who've been in long-term monogamous relations with a partner who tests negative, people who have 2 and 3 children who test negative and a partner who tests negative who suddenly themselves tests positive, And many times when we stay in touch, we find that ultimately they give birth to negative testing children, having not used any of the drug therapies or medical interventions recommended/mandated by doctors here in the U.S. There are just situations that constantly break, defy, bend all the rules that we're taught are very black and white. And each one has very profound implications on the lives of those who come up against these rules.
There's no other test like the HIV test, really. All the boxes, the HIV test boxes, they've got disclaimers that say this doesn't prove you've got the virus. And furthermore, no other test features the dilution of your blood by up to 400 times before administering the test. You got something like a measles test, you dilute the blood once, twice, 3 times, 4 times over. 400 times dilution of the blood? Why would they need to dilute the blood that much before testing it? Sounds counterintuitive.
That's a very interesting question, and one of the experts that appears in The Other Side of AIDS, Dr. Rodney Richards, he's a chemist who was a founding scientist at Amgen and worked under contract with Abbott Laboratories in creating the very first HIV antibody test. He points out that in the development of the HIV antibody test, they realized they had to calibrate it so too many people wouldn't test positive. They were having, at the very beginnings of the development of the test, a disconcerting number of healthy blood donors with no risk factors and no explanations for potential transmission who were testing positive. So much so, he recounts a story of a colleague who one day announced he was quitting the business and moving to another state, and when they asked why, he said, because everybody in Los Angeles is going to die. There's so many people who are testing HIV positive, there's going to be an apocalypse here, and I'm getting out now while I can. So they had to find a way to keep enough people in risk groups, so-called risk groups, testing positive, and enough people outside risk groups, as they're called, not testing positive. And one of these is apparently, because there's no explanation for this high dilution rate, one of the ways they did this was, taking the blood and diluting it 400 times.
Yeah, and Dr. Robert Giraldo's ad hoc testing, which he performed, indicates that maybe that's exactly what they did, because he went the other way. He used neat blood, no dilution whatsoever, and ran that by the HIV tests, came up positive every single time.
Very important to explore the implications of that. If everyone has the potential, if everyone carries whatever it is that responds on these HIV tests, it'd be interesting to find out why some people carry enough to have the test respond, and does that mean anything, and does it mean anything only in risk groups or outside of risk groups? None of these issues are explored, and that discourse should fit very succinctly into mainstream thinking and mainstream explanation. That's not at all radical. It's just good science and good medical practice. But even that scenario can't be explored with, the authority of this AIDS, establishment. It sounds blasphemous to even bring it up for discussion, but I think it's really important that all evidence we have for the existence of HIV is indirect. Things have been going on and on based on those inferences and assumptions and indirect evidence, which to me is fascinating and also clarifies why it is the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, who, as we see from recent media reports, will apparently approve anything, has never approved any HIV test kit for the specific intended purpose of actually diagnosing HIV infection or for confirming the presence of HIV.
Despite the fact that the science behind it is so flimsy, the culture of hysteria has been used to trample all over people's civil rights, human rights, and their medical rights.
And parental rights, I want to mention,
and
too,
their parental rights.
Someone who is a mother and who tests HIV positive, I live very strategically. Our kids see 3 separate private practice pediatricians regularly, even though they've never had any compelling reason to go to a doctor, just so we maintain ironclad medical records and proof of their excellent health in the event that someone tries to come down on us for not following the recommendations/mandates here in the U.S. that if you're positive, you need to be on the drugs, your children must be tested, and if they are positive in spite of good health, they must go on the drugs. I recently read an article in a medical journal that actually overtly stated, even when children who test HIV positive are clinically healthy, they must be forced to take the drug therapies, even if this means taking them from their parents' custody.
One of the main aspects of your work has been defending the rights of parents in these situations, and you've helped many people who found themselves caught up in the maw of all this. What's the current state of play, Christine? How do you assess... Sorry?
It's pretty bleak here. It's very difficult to find your way out of that system. I mean, most people, and I'm talking about people who are, upper middle class, normal, well-educated, employed individuals who find themselves living like spies or criminals in order to retain their children in their custody and exercise their right to make informed choices with regard to their health care.
What do you think the attitude of the pharmaceutical industry is in response to the questions that have been raised?
Well, I see here that they must clearly recognize that there's a diminishing market for their products here in the United States, because even though this was declared, at least in the U.S., the year of the woman with regard to HIV and AIDS, at the same time, the same media reports on that acknowledge that there has been no increase in the number of women testing HIV positive in the U.S. The notion that certain minorities are testing HIV positive in greater numbers cannot be borne out in fact. And I think what the drug companies are doing in this case is they are resorting to these tactics that involve funding African American churches in various cities across the nation to encourage parishioners to create programs that are about testing days and, taking responsibility for your health and encouraging members of the church to take what are called HIV tests, thereby, hoping to drum up, one could say, a market for their products.
It's ironic, isn't it? Taking responsibility for your health, it's such a nice one, but what you're actually doing is handing over responsibility for your health to somebody else.
Well, you're also engaging in a very irresponsible test. It's never been validated. There are no studies that point to its true accuracy, specificity, sensitivity. It's never been approved by the U.S. FDA for the specific intended purpose of diagnosing HIV infection, so it's hardly a responsible test. But without this encouragement, and the most recent news is, we must have everyone now take HIV tests, what other way do you either maintain or expand your market? You have to get more customers, and the way you get more customers is through testing. And, the rationale for this widespread testing in the U.S. is ludicrous. Every year since 1996, they've been touting the same estimate of the number of Americans who test HIV positive. They say 40,000 Americans a year test HIV positive. It's an estimate. It even says it in the articles. And then they further speculate that a certain percent, depending on the article, 30% to 50% of these estimated HIV positive Americans don't even know they're HIV positive, which brings up the question, well, if they don't know, how do you know?
Yep.
I mean, it's silly. We have it, at the very least, a stable, if not diminishing problem, all described through estimates. And yet now the move is to, curb in this non-growing, perhaps non-existent epidemic with widespread testing. The only motivation that I can think of is to create a greater market for the ultimate end products.
And that's a problem we've got really at the heart of the medical profession and the pharmaceutical industry. If you make medicine and health a profit business, producing profit means more sickness. More sickness is more profits. It's only going to go one way, and it has gone that way.
Modern medicine is not about health. It's about alleviating symptoms, and that isn't, in any case that I can think of, actually creating, enhancing, inspiring, achieving, or maintaining health. It's about suppression of symptoms. Sometimes it's about replacement of function, but the paradigm of modern medicine is to destroy, suppress, remove, radiate. It has nothing to do with health. So whatever solutions are coming out of that tend to be focused on those unhealthy activities and ventures, and really the money to be made is not in cures but in chronic, manageable conditions, medicines that manage these so-called chronic conditions but not cure them.
Yeah.
If you have a cure, you have a one-time only customer. If you're managing the problem, well, then you have a customer for the rest of their life.
Yeah, exactly. And you can maximize the profit. Maybe that's why they brought down the medication level of AZT from 1,250 milligrams, which was killing everybody who took it at that rate, down to around about 450 milligrams a day, which kept you alive, and a continuing profit center.
Paranoid or conspiratorial. I just want to mention, pharmaceutical companies are not benign entities. They're not benevolent, groups. They're businesses, and they answer to shareholders' concerns, and they need to generate a bottom line. There's people think, the researchers, they wear white coats, they're the good guys. These are businesses, and the job of a business is to generate profits, sell, create new markets, expand markets, dump old products somewhere where they can be sold when they're no longer wanted in another market. They're functioning exactly as a business does, as successful businesses do. So there's nothing paranoid or conspiratorial about any of this discussion. It's simply business as usual.
It is business as usual. We've seen it, Christine, even leaving aside HIV/AIDS, we've seen it in the astonishing decision in recent days by the FDA to allow Vioxx and similar drugs to continue to be sold. Even in the medical profession, jaws dropped at the effrontery of that move. And you'll notice as well that they cited patients who had given testimony to them that they needed the drugs for chronic back ailments. I know the medical pharmaceutical people have outreach programs into the patient communities precisely so they can haul these people out and put them at FDA meetings when they rubber stamp these decisions.
Absolutely. It's called, ironically, viral marketing. They fund support groups. They pay people to actually be marketers at online internet sites and go in and talk as if they were patients and talk up the benefits of a drug. Those are actual job positions, and those are actual advertising and promotion techniques that pharmaceutical industries employ to generate and sustain demand for their products. It's a well-known fact. It's also very well-known. Drug companies say, the reasons that drugs cost so much is the incredible amount that we invest in research and development, when in fact, recent analysis shows that they spend the overwhelming majority of their money in promotion.
So we're up against an industry which has monopolistic rights, which enable it to make huge profits. They reinvest those profits in marketing fear mostly, marketing heavily to doctors. So we're really going to need all our inventiveness to try and defeat these people, especially when they have the government in their pocket.
Yeah, it's the most powerful political lobby here in the United States and probably in the world. The pharmaceutical industry wields an incredible influence over our lives here in the United States.
Despite the power of the medical profession within society and the pharmaceutical industry structurally within capitalism, we have had some successes. About a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to Francine Yurko, the wife of Alan Yurko, who's getting out on the 7th of March, having beaten the rap on the spurious charges of shaken baby syndrome. That is so encouraging, Christine.
Yeah, and I'm really honored and proud to say that one of the advisors on Alive and Well Scientific Advisory Board helped Alan Yurko in his case. Dr. Muhammad Ali Al-Bayati, who's a pathologist and toxicologist, was the one who highlighted the fact that in Alan Yurko's son's autopsy, there were such egregious errors, such as the baby being described as African American when in fact he was Caucasian, the coroner reporting on the baby's heart when the heart had been removed from his body for donation. Just amazingly ridiculous errors in this report that caused the coroner in that county in Florida to be permanently banned from ever performing an autopsy again.
Yeah, I read Dr. Al-Bayati's submissions in relation to the Alan Yurko case. They were deadly pieces of medical investigation and played a pivotal role. And we're all of us very grateful to Dr. Al-Bayati for the work that he does. As well as that, I wrote an article based on his research. He showed that the infant had received an overdose of heparin, which is a blood thinner,
right,
not too dissimilar to warfarin. And all of those are not too dissimilar to rat poison. So I think I put a headline like "Rat Poison Killed Yurko Infant," because that's what it came down to.
That's a very subtle headline.
Well, loads of people who have been campaigning on behalf of Alan Yurko love the headline. Yeah.
I'm teasing you. It's to the point. It's to the point, and I'm exhilarated that he's actually being released so soon. That's a wonderful victory on many levels for many people fighting many issues.
It is, and I'm looking forward to Alan Yurko on the outside. I'm looking forward to us taking the battle back to these people, and it just shows you that, we do win a few, Christine. So part of what we're trying to do on breakfornews.com is to provide a forum which brings together people who are interested in aspects of the abuses of the pharmaceutical medical system, and also those who are opposing the same kind of interests globally in the Iraq war, in globalization, in genetic seed technology. We've got to start networking together, I think, Christine, and in the emerging internet media.
I think that's really important, Fintan, and I wholeheartedly support what you just said. If you break it down, the common denominator, whether the issue is vaccination or war or AIDS, the so-called enemies are kind of all the same, and the tactics used are not changing much from one area to another. Marketing based on fear, misinformation, and things portrayed as helpful that are ultimately harmful. We see this over and over again, and the sooner we pool our resources and understand that those that are in power over these issues have their tentacles in all these areas, I think the closer we'll come to creating a rational, truly healthy, and free society.
Christine, it's been great to talk to you again.